I'm very pleased to present this report this morning. The National Academy of Sciences appointed a commission more than 2 years ago, a committee, of people who were appointed to represent a spectrum of views, and the committee was justified by the Congress, and funds were appropriated for the committee, so the committee had good resources to conduct this report, and the committee had a very specific assignment, and that is to come up with a plan to reduce child poverty by half within 10 years. As we found out, it's not so easy to figure out a way to reduce child poverty by half within 10 years, but of course, the committee did it. And it would be good to ask questions about it, and we'll give you an opportunity to do that. So today we're going to begin by presenting the results of the committee report, and then we're going to have some presentations about the committee report, primarily from people who are on the committee, but from other people as well. We'll have discussion among the members we're going to have 2 panels on the report. We'll have discussion among the members, and then we'll give people in the audience an opportunity to ask questions. I think probably the main reason the committee was successful is because of this gentleman right here on my right, Greg Duncan. Greg has an extremely distinguished scholarly background. He's a distinguished professor in the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine. He spent 25 years at the University of Michigan working on and eventually directing the much-loved panel study of income dynamics, which has more numbers than anything known to man or God. He held a faculty appointment at Northwestern University between 1995 and 2008. He's part of a team conducting, many of you probably read about this, I bet I've seen 4 or 5 articles about this, conducting random assignment trial assessment impacts of income supplements on the cognitive intellectual development of infants born to poor mothers in 4 diverse communities in the United States. Great.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks everybody for coming. Let me move through this report very rapidly. First, let me pay my respects to our study sponsor. A lot of the money came from Congress, but it was instrumental that a number of other foundations chipped in to enable us to do all the work that we did. Committees are selected carefully by the National Academy to be diverse in many respects. Ours was indeed diverse. We had a number of academics. You can see the list of people. Christine James Brown will be on the panel, the second panel. Tim Smeeting will be on the first panel. It was a wonderful group of people to work with, and what really made it work was everyone bought into the standard of evidence that the National Academy insisted for its panels. So a lot of debates ended up being settled by, well, show me the evidence. Oh, I can't do that. So we move on. These committees are directed by their statements of task. And in our case, there were 3 elements to the statement of task. First, to review the existing research on links between child poverty and child well-being. Second, to analyze the anti-poverty effects of existing programs. And third, and most important, to come up with ideas for program and policy enhancements and packages of policy and program enhancements that would reduce child poverty in half in 10 years. The 10-year time frame is very important here. It excluded intergenerational kinds of programs, right? So early child care programs that might have lifelong benefits. Those benefits of reducing poverty aren't going to come until the next generation, so they don't really fall into our 10-year time frame. There should be another committee formed to look at intergenerational poverty issues, but that was not us. We were focused on this 10-year window. So first element of the statement of task was to review the existing evidence, correlational and causal evidence on the impact of poverty on child well-being. In the report, the chapter itself concentrates on the causal studies. There's a large appendix that reviews the correlational studies. These conclusions are developed after a great deal of discussion by the committee. So every word is chosen very carefully. So in the case of causal impacts of child poverty, we said that the weight of the causal evidence, not all studies, but most studies, indicates that poverty itself causes negative child outcomes, especially when poverty occurs early in childhood or persists throughout a large portion of childhood. Right? So this was really trying to cut through the correlation versus causation, and we focused on the strongest experimental and quasi-experimental studies. We also reviewed the literature on the extent to which programs, existing programs, seem to affect child well-being. And in this case, the conclusion was that many programs that alleviate poverty either directly by providing income transfers like the Earned Income Tax Credit, or indirectly, programs like food stamps, the SNAP program, medical insurance have been shown to improve child well-being. All right, so that's the conclusion from the chapter that reviews that evidence. Second element of the statement of task was to evaluate the anti-poverty effectiveness of existing programs. And for this, we used the Urban Institute's TRIM3 microsimulation program. We were very grateful that we had the resources and the cooperation to do that. We were directed to use not the official poverty measure, which relies on cash income alone, but rather to use the supplemental poverty measure, which includes an evaluation of in-kind benefits from Earned Income Tax Credit, food stamps, and things like that. The TRIM3 model also adjusts for underreporting in several major sources of transfer income. So when you do all of that, change to the supplemental poverty measure, adjust for underreporting, you end up with an estimate, this is 2015, of child poverty equaling 13%. So 13% of all children in the United States were estimated in 2015 to be living in families with income below the poverty line. Poverty line is around $22,000, $24,000 for a family of four. It depends on geographic residence, but that's our 13%, and that's the baseline against which we evaluated how much poverty would increase if we didn't have existing programs and how much poverty would decrease if we imposed our enhancement ideas. So in this case, we're looking at how much higher poverty would be if programs that are currently in place were not in place. And the estimate here is that the poverty rate would be 8.7 percentage points higher. In other words, 21.7% if all existing transfer programs were taken away. If you look at which programs seem to matter the most, it's tax credits, the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit in particular, and SNAP. Those two had by far the biggest poverty reducing impacts. In the case of tax credits, if they were removed, you'd have a rate that was 5.9 percentage points higher, in other words, 18.9%. You can see the poverty reducing effect of these other programs. In the case of deep poverty, which is defined as 50% of the official SPM supplemental poverty measure line, in other words, about $13,000, $12,000 for a family of four, the poverty rate is about 3%, and in that case, by far the most potent deep poverty reducing program is SNAP. Tax credits don't matter as much because people with incomes that low don't have the taxable income to qualify for many of the tax credits. All right, but the heart of the report is really developing these program and policy options and then seeing what impacts they would have. So we looked at 10 different areas, and in each area we developed a modest and more generous version of these program and policy options, and we also considered packages of programs. We also, and I'll show the list of program and policy ideas that we tried to develop simulations for, but the evidence wasn't sufficient. But here's what we could simulate in these different areas. Upper left shows the different work-related options that we considered: expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, expanding child care subsidies. One of the most interesting proposals, I think, was to take the Child Independent Care Tax Credit and focus benefits on low-income families, make it 100% reimbursable for expenses up to $4,000 for a child under the age of 6, $3,000 for a child over the age of 6, and then gradually phase it out up to an income of $55,000. We experimented with raising the minimum wage. In this case, we brought the minimum wage up to $10.25 an hour. I know that some states and some municipalities are going up to $15 an hour. But this illustrates our conservative approach to the simulations. We don't really know what's going to happen, especially to employment with a $15 an hour minimum wage. From the past literature, we're much more comfortable simulating a more modest increase in the minimum wage. So that's how we chose our $10.25. We also tried to find a proven sectoral training program that we could scale up, perhaps. And the one that seemed most promising is a program called Work Advance. There's a nice set of evaluations, random assignment evaluations. And in this case, it was just run as a demonstration, and we made assumptions about scaling that up to 2 different levels. At the bottom, we had 2 proposals related to removing restrictions on immigrant access to benefits. Right-hand side, more traditional income support programs, expanding SNAP, the food stamp program, housing voucher program, and then supplemental security income, the child benefits be more generous. We also, and this turned out to play a fairly prominent role, had an idea for replacing the existing child tax credit with a child allowance. The child tax credit now provides $2,000 per child per year for families up to $200,000 or $400,000, depending upon whether it's 1 or 2 parents. We'd replace that with a child allowance of $2,000, but then make it available all the way down to families with 0 income. Finally, we experimented with a child support assurance program, which would provide a guaranteed benefit to children with a legal support order. As I said before, there were a number of programs that we tried to develop simulations for. Long-acting reversible contraceptive programs, for example, primarily focused on women's health, but there might be some secondary impacts on child poverty. There's evidence accumulating about the extent to which it affects fertility, but there wasn't strong enough evidence about the extent to which it would then link to child poverty changes. Mandatory work programs, we spent a lot of time trying to understand the evidence from the 1990s, where there were random assignment evaluations of mandatory work programs, from the history of what happened once the welfare reform was implemented, and then from the more recent attempts to hook work requirements onto programs. But here again, the evidence let us down. It was either ambiguous or simply non-existent. And one of our research recommendations is to bring back the good old 1990s, where when we experimented with alternatives to AFDC, we required that there be a random assignment experiment to judge its impacts. We're doing all sorts of experimentation now, but we're not learning anything. So one of our recommendations is to start learning things. Marriage promotion programs, they've been tried, and none seem to be consistently successful at promoting marriage. TANF, again, we're not learning much from the freedom given to states about TANF. Family and paid medical leave, block grants, again, we tried all of these, to work all of these into simulatable policies, but failed owing to lack of evidence. In some cases, for certain population groups, we're let down by the current population survey sample sizes, so we've got recommendations about using administrative data for these kind of populations. And then finally, the big elephant in the room is medical insurance, which consumes 1/3 of the federal spending on children. But the supplemental poverty measure does not have a way of accounting for the value of health benefits. So we have an appendix and some recommendations about taking the next step to increase the comprehensiveness of the supplemental poverty measure to include health insurance. Okay, so let's go back to the 20 ideas. These show the extent to which each taken by itself would be expected to reduce that 13.0% child poverty rate. All right, so the first EITC option, which is to essentially keep the run in and phase out parts the same, but then increase the height of the benefit, would reduce child poverty by 1.2 percentage points from that 13.0 level. You can see that the two child allowances, child allowance one is this $2,000 per year per child, child allowance $3,000. The second child allowance two is a $3,000 per child per year. The expansions of SNAP, housing vouchers, they also produce substantial decreases, but nowhere near the 50% reduction that we were mandated to try to come up with. As we look across these 20 programs and just plot cost versus poverty reduction, it's a pretty linear relationship. So way out on the right, there's child allowance two, that's the $3,000 per child per year child allowance, has the biggest impact on reducing child poverty, but at an annual cost of about $55 billion. Right? And you can see the trade-offs here as you get to less expensive programs and less effective programs. One of the nice things about TRIM 3 is that it produced not only estimates of poverty reduction and cost, but also changes in labor market effort. And in this case, we worked very hard, Robert Moffett and Hillary Hoynes run our committee, to plug in the latest consensus evidence of what labor supply responses were. By and large, the income support programs reduced employment. This is employment among adults living in households below twice the poverty line by 50,000 to 150,000. But that downside for the income support was more than matched by the upside from the work enhancement, expanding earned income tax credit, this child and dependent care tax credit, where you got increases up to 500,000 jobs, right? So if you don't have any single program that's going to do the job, is it possible to combine programs and packages? And that's the next step. And maybe in doing so, we could get the best of both worlds. So here are the four packages that we came up with. First one, we said, let's give work its due. Let's try to come up with a 50% poverty decrease rather, just with work programs, right? So we took earned income tax credit, the child and dependent care tax credit expansion, increase the minimum wage to $10.25, and then roll out this work advance program. That reduced child poverty by about 20%, right? Well short of the 50% goal. It had a whopping increase in employment. 1 million more people would be employed, low-income people would be employed with these work incentive programs taken as a package at a cost of $8.7 billion a year. Okay, so intriguing in many respects, but not getting to 50%. In the second package, we added a child allowance, $2,000 child allowance. That gets much more poverty reduction, 35.6%, 41% reduction in deep poverty. It's still netting 568,000 more jobs, but now the cost is $44 billion. And the last two were designed to reach the 50% goal. In the first, we expanded existing programs, SNAP and housing voucher programs. Again, the increase in employment from the work enhancement more than offset the reductions from the income support programs, but cost of $90 billion for the first and $110 billion per child per year in the second. So quite a range of cost. One of the other things we were asked to do was review the literature. It's a fairly brief literature on what the annual costs of child poverty are, costs in terms of reduced earnings, cost in terms of increased criminal justice costs, increased health costs. And those studies come up with estimates of between $800 billion a year to $1.1 trillion per year. So it provides some perspective on the costs of our packages. Lessons from the packages, individual policy and program changes are insufficient. But these bundles, these packages, are intriguing because you can get the best of both worlds, poverty reduction as well as increased work. We spent a lot of time thinking about contextual factors that affected the effectiveness of the program and policy options. Dolores Acevedo Garcia will talk about that a little bit. And finally, we ended up with research priorities. We need experimentation like the good old 1990s. We need more research on these contextual factors that Dolores will talk about, and finally improvements to the federal data system. So with that, let me stop. These National Academy reports are free online. It does say 600 pages for the PDF versions currently available, but that's divided into 220 pages of report and then a whole bunch of appendices. And there are a lot of other tools and information sources available if you go to the website. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.